Well, to help us explore this a little bit more, we're now joined by Professor William Gumede, who's an Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the programme.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very grateful, very happy to be with you.
All right, so me and you, we've both got grey hair, which means we've seen a lot of South Africa. And 60.6, that is a huge number if we think back to 1994 when we were voting for the first time.
Yes, but you know, I think in 1994 we most probably also had an undercount. If you think about it, you know, we were moving out of the apartheid era, and it was the integration of the homeland system also, and during the apartheid era, I don't think there were accurate records for Black people around the country. I think the interesting thing for me, from a growth rate point of view, if you look at our emerging market peers, let's say our BRICS countries, last year, Brazil grew at 0.7%. And if you compare us also with, like, say, an industrial country, Europe collectively, their population last year grew with 0.6%. And then, interestingly, Africa collectively, outside South Africa, so if you combine all African countries and exclude South Africa, grew at 2.5%.
All right, so where does that place us then in terms of our growth rate? We'll link it to the economy and all of that just now, but what does it tell us about the rate of growth?
You know, what it tells us is we need at least a 6% growth rate to deal with the population growth. So we need an economic growth rate of 6%. To deal, you know, with all. If we have a growth rate, there's certain demands on infrastructure, on homes, on roads, on education, on health, and in order to cater for that, we as a country need at least a 5-6% growth rate.
I'm not sure what the statistics are when you break them down, but anecdotally, when you look around the world, the more affluent you are, the less children you tend to have, which suggests then this growth means things like poverty and inequality are growing at the same rate.
Yes, I mean, it can be crucial if you look at countries like Japan. I mean, last year, for example, Japan, you know, and Japan is an industrial country in the top 5 biggest economies in the world. I mean, Japan its population didn't grow last year. In fact, it declined by minus 0.3%, so decline. And if you see other industrial countries, what happens if a country gets richer and more affluent and, you know, upper middle class, people have fewer children, and it reduces. And the population rate reduces. We are sitting, I think, a little bit with Brazil, where, you know, emerging markets, we're sort of in between. Our growth rate is not as high as it would be in other African countries that are poorer than us, but we sort of we sit right in the middle between very, very rich countries in Europe and very poor countries in Africa. I think most probably what has happened, why our growth rate is such at 1.5% plus, is and not at, for example, 0.7%. I think it's also, you know, the influx of people to South Africa that gives us, you know, that extra, that additional population growth rate. So naturally, you know, our growth rate should sit around 0.7% or 0.8%, sort of where Brazil is sitting, but Brazil is obviously not getting our kind per capita, our numbers of people from neighboring countries.
All right. So government now sitting with these statistics must be, I mean, I'm talking about things like social protection. We've talked about the economy. It needs to grow at a certain rate. It's not doing that. So the next thing now becomes, how do you manage to help those that are going to be falling through the net? I guess this is the biggest headache right now.
No, absolutely. Because again, if you compare us, for example, our emerging markets because our peers, like in Brazil or let's say South Korea and so on, since 1994, all of those countries since 1994 compared to us all have actually their economies have expanded. So they now the economies are now bigger. Our economy has declined. So. And I think that's the strategy, the tragedy of South Africa post 1994. Although we have, we've got this growth rates of 1.4, 1.5%, but because of corruption, mismanagement, state failure, investment flight, and capital and skills flight, the pie, our economic pie, has actually shrunk. So our economy has become smaller than what it was. Let's just say if one compare it to our peers, every year we decline. Our economy is declining, while our peers, the economies are rising. So we are really sitting with an absolute challenge here.
And then the other statistic is that the majority of this growth is young, black, female. We already know that young people are the most disadvantaged. We know that the girl child is even more disadvantaged. So again, we're seeing the most vulnerable becoming even more vulnerable with this population growth.
Yes, I mean, I think it's extraordinary in our country is that, young people are the majority, but if you look at politics and you look at the economy, they are not represented. So our country is run at all levels by very old people, and the population of the country are very young. So, that's an extraordinary mismatch. So it just means that sort of, at the leadership level, whether it's in politics or in the economy, the social distance between them and, the majority of people are so wide that there's almost, there's no link. I mean, I'll just give you an example. For example, the ANC's National Executive Committee, if you look at the age group, the average age group there is, 50 plus. And then you look at its supporters and so on, and the voters, potential voters, are very, very young. Now, I think behind the numbers, maybe some of the more frightening things behind the numbers doesn't really show the fact, the numbers of people actually leaving the country, but people leaving the country, the kind of people that we don't want to leave the country. So the people with the money, the people with the skill set, with the scarce skills, the people with the energy, people with the ideas, who are actually leaving the country. And often they don't say they're leaving the country. They say, well, you know what, I am going to work abroad, and so on. So we have a population growth rate on the one hand, and then we also have our critical skills and critical people leaving the country because they feel, the country is going nowhere because of corruption, state failure, and so on.
Yeah, now I want to end on a positive note. There must be a plus side to this, and I guess it could be that because we've got a young population, we're not going to face the same drama countries like Japan and some of the Nordic countries where we will have nobody to work in the near future.
Almost, the Europeans almost have when a country is affluent, when a country is upper middle class, that's a good thing. So even if you have the population not growing that much, because you've got stability. Yeah. Our problem is that we've got a young population, but we don't have the economy. The economy cannot provide for the population, or it's not working for the population. So we're sitting potentially with a crisis on our hands of young people who are not educated, who can't find jobs, and who are not able to operate in a market economy. And that represents in the future a potential source of instability for the country, rising crime, breakdown of rule of law, popular anger because people are frustrated. So really this youth, the youth for us is almost a time bomb unless we change the economy around. Our government governs more honestly, more competently, and bring more people into the economy and more inclusively. If we don't do that, our youth bulge is going to be a time bomb for South Africa.
Professor Gumede, we'll leave it there for the time being. Yeah, interesting stats to digest, and let's see how this does play out. But thanks so much indeed for your insights tonight.